By early 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. 3 years after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces still held a broad arc of islands from the Kuriles through the Central Pacific to the Dutch East Indies, but the cohesion of this perimeter had been eroded. Defeats around Guadalcanal, the evacuation of the Central Solomons, and losses in the Bismarck Sea and at Rabaul had reduced the offensive potential of the Japanese Navy. Carrier air groups that had gone to war in 1941 with experienced aviators were now largely rebuilt with pilots trained in shorter programs, while fuel shortages limited large-scale training at sea. For Tokyo, the Marianas formed part of what planners called the Absolute Defense Zone, a belt of key positions that also included the Carolines and the Palaos. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam lay roughly 2,400 kilometers from Tokyo, close enough that land-based bombers operating from these islands could reach the Japanese home islands. At the same time, they controlled sea lanes linking Japan with the resources of Southeast Asia. Protecting this zone was not only a military requirement, but also a political one, since its loss would bring the war closer to the Japanese public and expose the limits of earlier expansion. The islands themselves had been under Japanese administration since 1919, when they were transferred from Germany as a League of Nations mandate. Over the following 2 decades, Japanese civilian settlement increased, especially on Saipan, where tens of thousands of settlers engaged in sugar cultivation and trade alongside Chamorro and Carolinian communities. Guam formed an anomaly in this chain. Retained by the United States after 1898, it served as a modest American naval and communications outpost until its capture by Japanese forces in December 1941. By 1944, therefore, Operation Forager would involve not only opposing armed forces but also several civilian populations with different legal statuses and expectations. On the American side, debates about how to defeat Japan had produced 2 complementary lines of advance. In the southwest, forces under General Douglas MacArthur were pushing along New Guinea toward the Philippines. In the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz directed a step-by-step movement from the Gilberts to the Marshalls and then further west. The capture of Tarawa and Mopping in November 1943, followed by operations against Kwajalein, Roy Namur, and Eniwetok in early 1944, provided forward bases and revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of U.S. amphibious methods. Casualty levels in the Tarawa landings, in particular, encouraged closer study of reef conditions, naval gunfire preparation, and coordination with carrier air power. At the level of grand strategy, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington faced 2 linked questions: how to shorten the war and how to use growing American industrial output. By 1944, the United States was producing hundreds of warships and thousands of aircraft each month. New Essex-class carriers and fast battleships joined the fleet, while Army Air Forces units were receiving B-29s designed for long-range bombing. For these bombers to operate against targets on Honshu, suitable airfields were required. China-based options were technically possible, but depended on long and vulnerable supply lines over the Himalayas. The Marianas, if secured, offered an alternative based on sea lines of communication that the U.S. Navy believed it could protect. Japanese intelligence assessments recognized the danger, but differed on timing and direction. Some officers expected the next American move to target the Carolines or the Palaos, aiming at the large base complex at Truk. Others warned that the Central Pacific pattern after the Marshalls pointed directly toward the Marianas. The Imperial General Headquarters responded by creating the 31st Army to coordinate island garrisons in the area. On Saipan, Tinian and Guam, regular Army units, naval base forces, and local security elements were reinforced and ordered to prepare protracted defense in depth. However, shortages of concrete, heavy construction equipment, radar sets, and long-range aircraft limited how far these plans could be implemented. For planners in both capitals, Operation Forager thus emerged from intersecting calculations. In Washington, it represented an attempt to bring American air power within range of Japan and to tighten the maritime blockade by cutting trans-Pacific routes. In Tokyo, it was perceived as a test of the absolute defense zone and of the ability of remaining carrier and land-based air units to challenge U.S. naval concentrations. For the inhabitants of the Marianas, who had already experienced more than 2 decades of imperial administration and 2 years of total war mobilization, the gathering fleets to the east signaled that their islands were about to become a central battlefield in a conflict decided far beyond their shores. In March and April 1944, the broad outlines of the next Central Pacific step were formalized. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs approved a sequence that moved beyond the Marshalls toward the Western Pacific, and Nimitz assigned the code name Forager to the Marianas operation. Staff officers in Pearl Harbor converted this directive into timetables, assault waves, and loading plans, synchronizing naval forces, carrier air groups, and ground units spread from Hawaii to the South Pacific. The target date for the first landings on Saipan was fixed for mid-June, leaving only a few weeks to concentrate ships and men at forward staging areas. Command arrangements reflected the structure of American civil-military cooperation. President Franklin Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs set broad priorities. Nimitz, as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Ocean areas, held operational authority. He delegated the conduct of Forager at sea to Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose Fifth Fleet would serve as the main striking force. Within this framework, Vice Admiral Richmond Turner commanded the Joint Expeditionary Force responsible for delivering the assault troops to the beaches, while Lieutenant General Holland Smith directed the V Amphibious Corps, which would fight ashore. Army units under Lieutenant General Robert Richardson, including the 27th Infantry Division, were integrated into the plan alongside the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. American preparations were visible in shipyards and ports across the Pacific. At Pearl Harbor, Espiritu Santo, Guadalcanal, and other bases, transports and cargo vessels loaded vehicles, artillery pieces, fuel drums, and rations. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, which had only recently been secured, engineers extended airstrips and piers to receive the incoming armada. New fast carriers, battleships, and cruisers formed the Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, while older battleships and fire support ships were grouped to provide close bombardment. In total, several hundred vessels of all types, from fleet carriers and battleships to destroyer escorts and landing craft, were scheduled to converge east of the Marianas in June. On land, assault units conducted rehearsals that combined ship-to-shore movement, coordination with naval gunfire, and casualty evacuation drills. Experience from Tarawa and Kwajalein led to more detailed beach intelligence, including analysis of aerial photographs and submarine periscope observations to identify reefs, channels, and possible strongpoints. Staffs produced beach diagrams, tide tables, and wave timing charts, while intelligence officers compiled estimates of Japanese troop strength and fortifications on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These estimates suggested garrisons of several tens of thousands of personnel in total, supported by coastal guns and airfields. On the Japanese side, the opening phase of Forager was experienced first as a tightening sense of expectation, rather than as a single observable event. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters issued orders to strengthen the island defenses within the absolute defense zone and to prepare a fleet operation, later designated A-Go, that would commit the remaining carrier force to a decisive battle if the Marianas were attacked. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in May 1944, inherited weakened formations, but retained the mission of seeking a major engagement that could alter the balance in the Central Pacific. Local command structures in the Marianas were adjusted to fit this strategy. The newly formed 31st Army under General Hideyoshi Obata was tasked with coordinating the defenses of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. On Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the main army garrison, while Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, formerly associated with the 1941 Carrier Strike Force, oversaw naval base units and air service elements. These organizations were supplemented by construction troops, logistics units, and civilian labor mobilized for field work. Defensive plans increasingly emphasized holding key ground for as long as possible and inflicting casualties on any landing force. As Allied submarines and reconnaissance aircraft intensified their patrols around the Marianas in April and May, Japanese garrisons became aware that attention was focusing on their sector. Additional units arrived by convoy, though these movements faced growing risk from American submarines targeting shipping between Japan and the Central Pacific. At the same time, ammunition and fuel stocks had to be divided among several threatened island groups, so that commanders in the Marianas could not assume they would receive all they requested. The opening phase of Operation Forager thus unfolded as a convergence of decisions and movements made at scales ranging from global strategy to individual island garrisons, setting conditions for the first direct clashes that would follow in June 1944. Strategic discussions around Operation Forager linked global objectives with very concrete geographic requirements. For American planners, the Marianas offered a rare combination: islands large enough for several long runways, harbors able to shelter logistics fleets, and locations that placed them within striking distance of Honshu. Estimates suggested that from airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, B-29 bombers could cover industrial centers in central Japan while operating along sea lines of communication that were already being secured by the U.S. Navy. The capture of this group was therefore framed as a step toward both intensified bombing and a tighter maritime blockade. Within the Joint Chiefs, the decision to prioritize the Central Pacific route reflected calculations about time and resources. Operations in the Marianas would employ forces already committed to Nimitz's theater, including carrier task forces and amphibious shipping, while MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and toward the Philippines continued on a parallel axis. The United States could allocate separate Army, Navy, and Marine formations to each, drawing on a manpower pool that, by 1944, allowed the deployment of several 100,000 personnel in overlapping campaigns. For Forager specifically, planners envisaged committing more than 100,000 ground troops to the initial assaults and garrison duties, supported by tens of thousands of sailors and airmen. The operational design broke the campaign into phases. Saipan was designated the first objective, as its capture was expected to outflank Tinian and put pressure on Guam. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, with the U.S. Army 27th Infantry Division in support, would form the main assault force. Once Saipan was secured, elements would shift to Tinian, while separate Army and Marine units targeted Guam. At sea, Task Force 58 would screen the landings, neutralize Japanese airfields, and be ready to engage any major surface force approaching from the west. Fleet oilers, repair ships, and tenders formed mobile bases that could replenish the carriers and battleships far from established ports. Logistics dictated much of the timetable. Supply officers calculated the daily requirements in fuel, ammunition, rations, and engineering materials for an operation taking place more than 5,000 kilometers from the U.S. West Coast and over 3,000 kilometers from Hawaii. Amphibious shipping had to be loaded so that units could access vehicles, artillery, and construction equipment in the correct sequence once ashore. Cargo manifests were arranged to support not only combat, but also the rapid building of airstrips, fuel farms, and hospitals. This planning assumed that once secured, the islands would host multiple bomber groups, each consuming large quantities of aviation fuel and spare parts. Japanese strategic goals were constrained by dwindling options. The absolute defense zone concept assigned high priority to the Marianas, but available forces were finite. The A-Go plan aimed to use the combined fleet's carriers and battleships, in coordination with land-based aircraft from the Marianas, Palaos, and Philippines, to inflict decisive losses on an American invasion force. Expectations were that perhaps 400 to 500 carrier aircraft and several hundred land-based aircraft could be assembled for such an operation, supported by 9 carriers, battleships, and cruisers. On paper, this could concentrate roughly comparable numbers of flight decks to the American fast carrier groups, though with less experienced pilots and tighter fuel margins. For the island garrisons, Japanese planning emphasized attrition. Defensive schemes on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam called for interlocking positions inland rather than a single line at the water's edge. Infantry regiments, artillery units, and tank companies built pillboxes, gun caves, and trenches intended to force attackers into repeated close-range engagements. Stockpiles of food, ammunition, and engineering material were positioned to sustain resistance even if coastal installations were neutralized. Commanders were instructed that even if defeat was likely, prolonging the battle would impose costs on American manpower and time, with potential implications for operations elsewhere. Both sides made assumptions that would shape the coming battles. American intelligence estimates often used round figures and tended to understate the number of combat-ready Japanese troops on Saipan and Guam, as well as the depth of fortifications. Japanese planners, for their part, overestimated the ability of land-based air units to survive preliminary bombardment, and underestimated the impact of American radar, fighter direction, and carrier sortie rates. Propaganda on each side presented the upcoming operations in terms consistent with domestic expectations. American newsreels described a methodical advance toward Japan and the liberation of Guam as an American territory, while Japanese statements emphasized determination to defend the Central Pacific Barrier and the honor associated with holding the absolute defense zone. In this way, strategic goals, operational plans, and logistical calculations converged in early 1944 around a small group of islands whose significance now extended beyond regional administration or colonial agriculture. The detailed tables and maps assembled in planning rooms in Pearl Harbor and Tokyo framed the Marianas as a key to the next stage of the war, even before the first landing craft approached their shores. In the second week of June 1944, the planning maps translated into movement. On 11 June, carrier groups of Task Force 58 approached from the east and began systematic strikes on the Marianas. Over several days, hundreds of sorties from fast carriers attacked airfields, harbor installations, and communications on Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Rota. Fighter bombers and dive bombers targeted runways and dispersal areas, while torpedo bombers carried general-purpose bombs against warehouses and fuel tanks. American reports noted the destruction of dozens of Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air, reducing the capacity of local air units to contest the sea approaches. For Japanese pilots and ground crews, these raids marked a transition from periodic reconnaissance alerts to sustained pressure. Airfields that had supported patrol flights and training now became primary targets. Some fighters and bombers managed to take off and engage the attackers, but losses mounted quickly. Anti-aircraft batteries around the runways consumed ammunition at a high rate, bringing down some attacking aircraft, but unable to prevent repeated strikes. Maintenance personnel attempted to repair craters and camouflage surviving planes, while signals units tried to maintain links with higher headquarters across damaged communication lines. Offshore, American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers moved in to begin pre-landing bombardment. On the 13th and 14th of June, heavy guns fired thousands of shells at identified artillery positions, coastal defenses, and suspected troop concentrations on Saipan. Spotter aircraft and radar data helped adjust fire, but dense vegetation and underground positions limited the ability of bombardment to eliminate all strong points. Japanese infantry and artillery units remained in caves and dugouts during the heaviest shelling, emerging between salvos to check positions and prepare for the expected landings. The first direct clash on Saipan came on the 15th of June, when the assault waves headed for the western beaches near Charan Kanoa. In the early morning light, waves of amphibious tractors and landing craft carried elements of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions toward 4 main beaches designated for the operation. Approximately 8,000 troops were scheduled to land in the initial wave, with additional battalions following through the day. Naval gunfire shifted inland just before the first vehicles reached the reef, attempting to suppress coastal guns and machine gun nests. From the defenders' perspective, the same scene appeared as the arrival of a dense line of silhouettes on the sea horizon, followed by the shapes of landing craft and smoke from naval artillery. Japanese observers relayed range and bearing data to coastal batteries that had survived the bombardment. As the American craft approached the reef and inner channels, artillery and mortars began firing. Some landing vehicles were hit and caught fire or sank, while others maneuvered through gaps. Infantry platoons disembarked under varying conditions, in some sectors encountering only light resistance at the waterline, in others facing concentrated small arms and mortar fire. By the end of the first day, American forces had secured a beachhead, roughly several kilometers wide and up to 1 kilometer deep in most sectors, though exact progress varied along the front. Units pushed inland to seize key terrain such as the Aslito airfield, approaches and low ridges overlooking the beaches. Casualty reports registered several hundred killed and several thousand wounded or missing among the assault troops during the opening engagements, while Japanese defenders recorded losses in forward companies and coastal gun crews. Both sides committed reserve elements to stabilize their respective positions. American commanders landed additional battalions. Japanese officers shifted units toward threatened sectors for counterattacks after dark. For civilians on Saipan, the first engagements produced rapid changes in daily life. Japanese settlers and local Chamorro and Carolinian families experienced the naval bombardment as an extended sequence of explosions, collapsing buildings, and fires. Many moved into caves, field shelters, or reinforced basements, assisted or directed by local authorities and military units. Some men were drafted into labor details to repair positions or carry supplies. Others attempted to move families away from areas expected to become battlefields. Communication with relatives on Tinian or in Japan was effectively cut, leaving individuals to interpret the scale of the operation from the visible concentration of ships offshore and the continuous air activity. As the sun set on June 15th, the first phase of the clash for Saipan had created a contested strip of coastline. American units held fragmented but expanding footholds. Japanese forces retained most of the interior, including the heights dominating the southern and central parts of the island. Each command now had to adjust its original expectations to the actual results of the initial day. American headquarters assessed which objectives had been reached and where resistance was strongest, while Japanese headquarters considered how to use limited reserves to challenge the beachhead before heavy equipment and further reinforcements could be brought ashore. During the nights that followed the initial landings on Saipan, the battle expanded in scale and complexity. On June 15th to 16th, Japanese infantry units launched counterattacks against the newly established American beachhead. Company and battalion-sized groups moved through cane fields and along ravines, attempting to reach gaps between marine positions and push them back toward the waterline. Illumination shells, flares, and pre-registered artillery fire marked the front, while machine gun sections and mortar crews on both sides tried to maintain fire discipline under limited visibility. These counterattacks inflicted casualties and forced local withdrawals in some sectors, but did not dislodge the beachhead. By morning, American units still held a continuous line, though some positions had changed hands more than once during the night. Reports from battalion and regimental headquarters noted platoons reduced by a significant fraction, shortages of mortar ammunition, and the need to rotate companies to the rear for reorganization. Japanese commanders recorded losses among junior officers and experienced non-commissioned officers who had led night assaults, reducing the cohesion of the defending formations. As more troops and equipment came ashore, the beach area itself became a point of friction. On June 16th and 17th, landing craft, amphibious tractors, and supply parties crowded limited stretches of coastline. Stacks of ammunition, fuel drums, and rations awaited distribution inland, while bulldozers tried to clear exits off the sand under intermittent artillery fire. Communications between naval beach parties and Army and Marine logistics officers sometimes proved incomplete, leading to delays in moving certain items, including artillery pieces and tanks, to the front. This congestion meant that units at the line occasionally lacked specific supplies despite the overall volume landed. Terrain and weather added further challenges. Inland from the western beaches, low ridges and ravines broke up the ground, offering cover to defenders and complicating coordinated advances. Heat and humidity affected marching speed and required careful water rationing. Medical personnel established aid stations close behind the front, where wounded from both sides sometimes lay in adjacent areas before evacuation. Engineers began work on converting the Aslito airfield, once seized, into a base for American aircraft, while also clearing mines and obstacles along newly occupied roads. Within American command structures, the demands of coordinating Marine and Army units under a single corps headquarters became apparent. The 27th Infantry Division was committed to extend the line and push toward the central high ground, operating alongside the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. Differences in doctrine, training tempos, and prior experience in amphibious operations produced varying rates of advance. Reports and later inquiries noted disagreements between Lieutenant General Holland Smith and Major General Ralph Smith of the 27th Division over the pace and method of the Army Division's attack. These tensions, while internal to the American side, formed part of the broader pattern of strain during the escalation phase. For Japanese commanders on Saipan, the crisis took a different form. Daily situation reports indicated that coastal areas had been lost, but that strong positions remained on the central heights and in the northern part of the island. Requests went out for additional ammunition and coordination, with expected air and naval support under the A-Go plan. General Saito had to decide how many troops to commit to continued counterattacks near the beachhead, and how many to retain for a later defensive stand in depth. Casualty estimates suggested that frontline infantry units were already significantly reduced, forcing the use of service troops and rear echelon personnel in combat roles. Civilians were increasingly drawn into the crisis. Japanese authorities on Saipan organized labor details from the settler population and from Chamorro and Carolinian communities to transport supplies, dig trenches, and extend cave shelters. At the same time, rumors spread about the course of the battle and the likely fate of the island. With radio reception intermittent and official announcements limited, many civilians based their understanding on the direction of artillery fire, the movement of troops, and the visible presence of American aircraft overhead. Some attempted to move northward away from the front, while others remained near familiar villages despite bombardment. At sea, the scope of the confrontation widened further. By 17th June, American submarines and reconnaissance aircraft had reported movements of major Japanese naval forces west of the Marianas. These contacts indicated that the combined fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was approaching with multiple carriers, battleships, and cruisers in accordance with the A-Go plan. Admiral Spruance and Vice Admiral Mitcher now had to balance two requirements: providing direct support to the Saipan landings and preparing to meet a large fleet action in surrounding waters. Task Force 58 adjusted its patrol patterns and refueling schedules while still maintaining combat air patrols and strike missions over the island. In Tokyo and Washington, reports from the Marianas and the surrounding seas were interpreted through wider political lenses. Japanese leaders followed updates on the Saipan defense and the sortie of the combined fleet as indicators of whether the absolute defense zone could be maintained. American leaders viewed the operation as both a test of amphibious and joint procedures and a step toward bringing B-29 units into action from island bases. The escalation around Saipan thus combined tactical crises on individual ridges and beaches with operational and strategic questions about fleets, air power, and domestic expectations, all converging in the third week of June 1944. The peak of the Marianas campaign coincided with the largest carrier battle of the war. On June 19, 1944, radar on American picket destroyers and carriers detected incoming Japanese air formations approaching from the west. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, consisting of 9 carriers carrying roughly 430 aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, had advanced to within strike range of the Saipan invasion force. Task Force 58, with 15 carriers and about 900 embarked aircraft, prepared to meet the attack while continuing to provide cover for operations ashore. The first Japanese strike waves, launched at long range, assembled in several groups of dozens of aircraft each. They included carrier-based fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, some flown by relatively inexperienced crews who had received only limited carrier training. American radar-directed fighter control vectored Grumman F-6F units to intercept these formations far from the main fleet. Encounters unfolded at altitudes where differences in training, tactics, and radio coordination played a decisive role. Many attacking aircraft were shot down before reaching effective release points. Those that broke through met dense anti-aircraft fire from screening ships. Over the course of 19 June, Japanese carriers launched 4 main attack waves involving more than 300 aircraft. American forces lost several dozen fighters and suffered bomb and torpedo hits on individual ships, but no fleet carrier was sunk. Japanese losses, including aircraft that failed to find their way back and ditched due to fuel exhaustion, amounted to a large proportion of the strike groups committed that day. Ozawa's staff received reports of sharply reduced air groups, forcing reconsideration of further large-scale launches. On June 20th, the balance shifted further. Having located the retreating Japanese fleet late in the day, Vice Admiral Mitcher ordered a long-range strike by more than 200 carrier aircraft, including torpedo bombers and dive bombers, despite concerns about recovery after nightfall. These aircraft inflicted fatal damage on the carriers Taiho and Shokaku, both of which eventually sank after internal explosions, and on Hio, which was lost to torpedo hits and fire. American pilots returning in darkness faced navigation challenges and fuel shortages. Some ditched near the task force and were later rescued. Overall, however, the two-day battle left the combined fleet with severely depleted carrier air strength. For Japanese planners, the outcome of the Battle of the Philippine Sea meant that the A-Go concept had not achieved its goal. The mobile fleet retained most of its capital ships, but had lost a large share of its trained carrier aviators and several carriers. This constrained future ability to contest American advances with carrier-based air power. On Saipan, however, the ground garrison remained engaged, and local commanders continued to receive orders to resist as long as possible, even as the expectation of significant reinforcement by sea or air diminished. While fleets clashed to the west, the fighting on Saipan reached a sustained intensity. By late June, American forces had pushed inland to capture Aslito Airfield, soon redesignated Isili Field, and were advancing toward the central mountain mass dominated by Mount Tapo Chau. The terrain forced attacks along narrow fronts, with infantry companies moving through built-up areas, sugar fields, and limestone ridges. Japanese units defended from cave systems and prepared positions, often surviving preliminary artillery and airstrikes before engaging assaulting troops at close range. Casualties rose on both sides as each contested key features that controlled observation and movement. Civilians experienced this phase as prolonged exposure to bombardment, displacement, and scarcity. Many Japanese settlers and local islanders had already left coastal villages for interior caves or ravines. Food stocks held by families or local authorities were gradually consumed, and access to wells or streams was complicated by combat in surrounding areas. Civil defense instructions from Japanese officials emphasized remaining under military authority and avoiding contact with advancing American troops, but individual responses varied. Some families stayed near Japanese positions. Others attempted to move through lines or surrender, sometimes under confusing or dangerous conditions. American engineers and logistics units used newly secured areas to expand infrastructure, even while fighting continued. Work crews extended runways, built fuel storage, and constructed supply dumps close to the front, making it possible to base land-based fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft on Saipan itself. These aircraft joined carrier planes in maintaining pressure on remaining Japanese positions and in flying patrols over surrounding waters. The conversion of a contested island into a forward base during ongoing combat illustrated the dual character of the campaign's peak: simultaneous tactical engagements and long-term preparation for subsequent operations, including the arrival of B-29 units later in 1944. Higher command decisions in this period reflected the evolving situation. In Washington, receipt of initial reports on the Battle of the Philippine Sea and on the capture of key parts of Saipan led to confirmation that Operation Forager's main objectives remained valid. In Tokyo, the loss of carrier air strength and the deteriorating ground situation prompted discussions about how to present developments to the public and how to adjust broader strategy in the Central and Southwest Pacific. For the soldiers and civilians on Saipan, however, the peak of the campaign was measured less in communiques than in the daily pressure of artillery fire, shortages, and the narrowing of options as front lines moved across the island. As organized Japanese resistance on Saipan contracted, both sides adapted their methods. After losing control of the central high ground, Japanese units withdrew northward into more compact defensive zones around villages, caves, and cliffs. Battalion and regimental remnants reorganized into composite groups, often mixing infantry, artillery, and service troops. Command posts shifted to underground chambers connected by tunnels, with runners and field telephones maintaining communication where possible. Emphasis moved from rigid front lines to clusters of positions designed to delay advances and make full use of concealed firing points. American formations adjusted their tactics accordingly. Rather than broad, rapid sweeps, infantry regiments advanced by small units, mapping cave openings, fields of fire, and likely approach routes. Platoons combined rifle squads, light machine guns, bazookas, and flamethrower teams, supported by tanks modified with improvised protection, and, in some cases, flamethrower equipment. Artillery batteries and naval gunfire liaison teams refined procedures for calling in short concentrated missions against specific cave systems or ridges, followed by immediate infantry exploitation. This method aimed to limit exposure to sudden counterfire from positions that had survived initial bombardment. The psychological and physical demands of this phase were notable. For American troops, repeated assaults on fortified caves meant close-range combat under conditions of limited visibility, high noise levels, and confined space. Rotations between frontline and reserve positions attempted to maintain unit cohesion, but casualty lists and the cumulative effect of continuous operations were reflected in medical reports noting combat fatigue and related conditions. Japanese soldiers, for their part, faced the erosion of supply lines, declining ammunition stocks, and the steady contraction of territory under their control, while still receiving orders to continue resistance. Civilian behavior reflected these pressures. Groups of Chamorro and Carolinian Islanders, along with Japanese settlers, moved repeatedly as front lines shifted. Some chose to surrender when encountering American patrols, influenced by leaflets, loudspeaker messages, and direct observation of captured civilians being evacuated. Others remained in caves or ravines under Japanese authority, influenced by pre-war and wartime propaganda that depicted the consequences of capture in alarming terms. These differing choices created a mosaic of civilian experiences within a relatively small area. As organized formations diminished, Japanese commanders considered how to use remaining personnel. One form of adaptation involved the consolidation of surviving combat troops, administrative staff, and even lightly wounded men into OHAC assault units. The aim was to mount large-scale night attacks that could disrupt American lines, inflict casualties, and possibly reach rear areas. Smaller infiltration attempts continued as well, with individuals or small groups attempting to penetrate between positions to attack command posts, aid stations, or artillery batteries. American units responded by tightening perimeter defenses, increasing the use of illumination, and organizing mutual support between adjacent companies. Meanwhile, planning proceeded for operations against neighboring islands. On Tinian, reconnaissance from the air and sea indicated a different beach configuration and defensive layout than on Saipan. American staff officers used lessons learned from recent fighting to refine the intended landing scheme, choosing narrower but potentially less defended beaches on the northwest coast rather than the more obvious bays. This represented an adaptation not only to local geography, but also to the expectation that Japanese defenders would anticipate conventional approaches. On Guam, where the pre-war American presence and the island's topography posed distinct issues, planners integrated experience with jungle fighting and coastal operations from earlier campaigns. Logistically, resistance and adaptation were visible in the shifting role of Saipan itself. Even before the last Japanese strongpoints were reduced, work on airfields and port facilities advanced. Supply officers redistributed stocks to support forthcoming assaults on Tinian and Guam, while medical units organized the evacuation of wounded from Saipan to rear area hospitals. Japanese forces, lacking comparable flexibility, sought to stretch remaining food and ammunition by rationing and by recovering usable material from abandoned positions. Instances occurred where both sides used captured equipment, such as artillery pieces or small arms, when compatible ammunition could be obtained. At the higher command level, adaptation took the form of revised timetables and theater-level directives. Nimitz and his staff assessed how quickly forces on Saipan could be turned around for new operations, without exceeding acceptable levels of fatigue and equipment wear. In Tokyo, the loss of effective carrier air support and the contraction of ground resistance led to renewed discussion of how to integrate remaining naval and air assets with Army garrisons further west, including in the Philippines and on other islands within the absolute defense zone. For both command systems, resistance on Saipan became one variable within a larger set of calculations that now had to account for changed conditions at sea and in the air. The turning point of Operation Forager on land came in the final days of organized resistance on Saipan. By early July 1944, American forces held the southern two-thirds of the island, including Mount Tapo Chau and the main airfield complex. Japanese units, reduced by weeks of combat, artillery fire, and shortages, had withdrawn into the northern sector around villages, cane fields, and the cliffs near Marpi Point. Command posts reported battalions reduced to company or platoon strength, with many weapons crews lost and ammunition stocks falling. Within this context, General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo concluded that continued static defense could not prevent the loss of the island. Communications with higher headquarters confirmed that no large-scale reinforcement by sea or air was possible after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Orders were issued to concentrate remaining Army and Navy personnel, including service troops and lightly wounded men, for a final coordinated attack. The aim was not to retake the island, but to inflict maximum casualties and demonstrate continued resistance, in line with broader guidance on defending the absolute defense zone. In the early hours of July 7th, Japanese forces launched a large-scale charge against positions held primarily by elements of the U.S. Army 27th Infantry Division, supported by Marine units on the flanks. Estimates suggest that several thousand Japanese soldiers, including personnel from support units and hospitals, took part. They advanced in depth along roads and through cane fields, initially overwhelming some forward American outposts, and penetrating into rear areas where artillery batteries, medical stations, and command posts were located. In close combat, American units suffered significant losses. Reports from the 27th Division recorded hundreds of killed and wounded within a few hours. American commanders responded by regrouping surviving companies, bringing in armored support, and calling down concentrated artillery and naval gunfire on routes of advance. By mid-morning, the attack had spent itself, leaving large numbers of Japanese dead in front of consolidated American lines. Surviving Japanese groups withdrew toward the northern cliffs, or continued to resist in isolated pockets. The episode marked the effective end of coordinated Japanese offensive operations on Saipan. From that point, combat on the island shifted to reducing remaining strongpoints and dealing with small groups and individuals operating independently. For civilians, the same period represented a critical change. As American units approached the northern end of Saipan, groups of Japanese settlers and islanders moved toward the cliffs and caves near Marpi Point. Pre-war and wartime propaganda had portrayed capture as carrying severe consequences, and some local officials and soldiers repeated such warnings. American forces attempted to use loudspeakers and interpreters to urge surrender, citing earlier evacuations of civilians to rear areas. Responses varied. Some individuals and families emerged and surrendered, while others remained in hiding or chose to jump from the cliffs. Exact numbers are difficult to establish, but Japanese military dead on Saipan are generally estimated at around 29,000, with several hundred taken prisoner and civilian deaths, including those during the final days, numbered in the thousands. The fall of Saipan had immediate operational effects on the rest of Forager. Even before the island was declared secure in early July, preparations for landings on Tinian accelerated. Using lessons from Saipan, American planners selected two narrow beaches on the northwest coast, designated White 1 and White 2, rather than the more heavily defended Broad Bays. On 24th July, approximately 15,000 troops from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions went ashore on Tinian against an estimated 8,000 to 9,000 Japanese defenders. The choice of landing site combined with prior deception measures and concentrated naval gunfire, allowed American units to establish a firm beachhead, with comparatively lower initial resistance than on Saipan, shifting the tactical balance from the first day. On Guam, the turning point took a slightly different form. After pre-invasion bombardment starting in mid-July, American forces, about 55,000 Marines and Army troops, landed on 21st July on beaches at Asan and Agat, facing roughly 18,000 Japanese troops of the 29th Division and associated units. Initial Japanese counterattacks in the first nights attempted to push the beachheads into the sea, but were repulsed with significant losses. Once American forces linked the Asan and Agat sectors and began to push inland toward the high ground, forming the island's central spine, Japanese units were gradually driven south and east. By early August, organized resistance on Guam had been confined to pockets in the south, and American commands could treat the island as effectively under their control, even as mopping up operations continued. These developments shifted the overall momentum of Operation Forager. Within a period of roughly 7 weeks, from the Saipan landings on June 15th to the collapse of organized resistance on Tinian and Guam in early August, the Marianas changed from a chain of Japanese-administered islands into a group of American-controlled bases. At sea, the loss of carrier air strength in the Philippine Sea limited Japan's ability to contest future amphibious operations at a similar scale. On land, the destruction or capture of the garrisons in the Marianas removed a key component of the absolute defense zone. For commanders and policymakers on both sides, the turning point of Forager thus lay not in a single day or engagement, but in this compressed sequence of events in mid-1944 that transformed the strategic map of the Central Pacific. By early August 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had ended, but combat did not cease immediately. On each island, small groups and individuals remained in caves or jungle areas, sometimes unaware that their commands had been destroyed, sometimes acting on orders to continue resistance independently. American units conducted systematic patrols, using interpreters and loudspeakers to call for surrender. Isolated skirmishes occurred for months, and on Guam and Saipan, some Japanese soldiers remained hidden for years, surfacing only after receiving confirmation that the war had ended. Military authorities now had to stabilize the new positions. On Saipan, where American casualties had reached roughly 3,400 killed and 13,000 wounded or missing, and Japanese military dead were estimated at around 29,000 with fewer than 1,000 prisoners, burial details worked to identify and inter bodies from both sides. Similar tasks were undertaken on Guam, where approximately 1,700 American personnel were killed and about 6,000 wounded, compared with an estimated 18,000 Japanese dead and about 1,000 prisoners, and on Tinian, where around 300 Americans were killed and 1,600 wounded, and Japanese military dead numbered about 8,000. These figures, while approximate, indicated the scale of the fighting and the imbalance between those killed and captured among Japanese forces, reflecting both tactical circumstances and prevailing orders. Civilians confronted an altered landscape. On Saipan and Tinian, many villages had been damaged or destroyed by bombardment and ground fighting. Japanese settlers and Chamorro and Carolinian islanders who had survived were assembled in temporary camps under American control, where they received food, medical treatment, and basic shelter. On Guam, local Chamorro communities emerged from forced labor, internment, or hiding as American forces regained control of the island. In all 3 cases, questions arose about land ownership, future administration, and the status of those who had lived under Japanese rule for decades. Immediate priorities, however, centered on disease prevention, distribution of supplies, and restoration of basic services. For Japanese prisoners of war, the aftermath involved interrogation and relocation. Military and civilian detainees were questioned about unit structures, supply routes, coastal defenses, and civilian conditions before being sent to camps in rear areas. Many had expected different treatment based on pre-war depictions of captivity. Their experiences, while varying by location and period, provided Allied intelligence agencies with detailed information on Japanese tactics, morale, and logistics in the Central Pacific. At the same time, Japanese authorities had little reliable data on the fate of individual soldiers and settlers in the Marianas, and many families in Japan received only general notifications that relatives were missing. American logistical and engineering units accelerated the transition from combat zones to operating bases. On Saipan, work continued to expand Islay Field and to build additional runways designed to accommodate very heavy bombers. Tinian, with relatively flat terrain, was surveyed for large airfield complexes. Within months, it would host several parallel runways capable of handling B-29 groups. On Guam, attention focused on rehabilitating pre-war port facilities at Apra Harbor, constructing new piers, depots, and repair installations, and expanding airstrips. These projects required thousands of construction troops, naval Seabees, and local labor, and they changed the physical appearance of the islands in ways that extended beyond immediate military needs. The removal of the Japanese garrisons and their replacement by American forces also altered the security environment in surrounding seas. Submarine patrols and long-range aircraft based in or operating through the Marianas increased surveillance of shipping lanes linking Japan with the Philippines, the East Indies, and the Central Pacific. Merchant and naval traffic that had previously used routes near the Marianas now faced greater risk, contributing to a tightening of the maritime blockade. For Allied sailors and air crews, the new bases provided staging points, rest areas, and repair facilities closer to operational zones than Hawaii or the South Pacific had been. Within Japanese command structures, the loss of the Marianas required immediate adjustments. The defeat of the mobile fleet at the Philippine Sea and the destruction of the island garrisons meant that the absolute defense zone concept, as originally defined, could no longer be implemented. Staff officers in Tokyo reassessed defensive lines, shifting emphasis toward the Philippines, Formosa, and the Ryukyus. Plans were made for new operations, including the reinforcement of Leyte and Luzon under conditions of reduced carrier aviation and growing shortages of fuel and shipping. The fate of the Marianas garrisons, however, remained present in internal discussions as an example of the limits of available resources. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the conclusion of major fighting in the Marianas was treated as both an operational success and a starting point for subsequent campaigns. Nimitz's staff integrated Saipan, Tinian, and Guam into updated schedules for operations in the Western Pacific, including planned moves toward the Palaos and the Philippines. Army Air Force's headquarters finalized deployment plans for B-29 units to the new bases, anticipating the start of sustained long-range bombing of targets in Japan later in 1944. For American policymakers, reports from the Marianas also raised questions about civilian administration, the future political status of Guam as an American territory, and the handling of Japanese and local populations under military government. On the islands themselves, withdrawal and aftermath were measured in more immediate terms: the clearance of battle debris, the reopening of roads, the re-establishment of schools and markets, and the adjustment of daily life to the presence of new authorities and large foreign garrisons. For many residents, the end of organized combat operations did not bring a return to pre-war conditions, but the beginning of a different phase shaped by new military infrastructures and by decisions taken far from the Marianas about how these islands would be used in the remaining months of the war. In the wider course of the war, Operation Forager altered both the geography and the methods of the Pacific conflict. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam provided the United States with bases from which B-29s could reach the Japanese home islands over open sea rather than over the Himalayas and occupied China. From late 1944, bombardment groups of the 20th Air Force began flying missions from the Marianas against industrial centers, transportation hubs, and urban areas on Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. The construction of multiple long runways on Tinian allowed the concentration of several hundred B-29s, while Saipan and Guam supported additional bomber, fighter, and reconnaissance units. These bases also served as hubs for naval logistics, repair, and command. For Japanese decision-makers, the use of the Marianas as a platform for sustained long-range bombing introduced a new dimension to the conflict. Air raid warnings and attacks on cities such as Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, including the firebombing of March 1945 and subsequent raids, brought destruction and displacement to urban populations and strained civil defense and relief systems. The combination of bombing, maritime blockade, and losses in the Philippines and Okinawa contributed to debates within Japanese leadership circles about the feasibility of continuing the war, appropriate conditions for negotiation, and the role of the emperor in any settlement. The earlier loss of the Marianas framed these discussions by demonstrating that the absolute defense zone had already been penetrated. The islands also became linked to the final phase of the war in another way. In August 1945, two B-29s based on Tinian carried the atomic bombs used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The missions themselves involved small crews and a limited number of aircraft, but they depended on the infrastructure and security provided by Operation Forager, secure runways, storage facilities, escorting fighters, and support units. For residents of the Marianas, this added a further layer to their island's role in global events, connecting local landscapes to decisions taken in Washington and Tokyo about new weapons and surrender terms. Post-war, the political and legal status of the Marianas reflected overlapping legacies. Guam returned to direct American administration as an unincorporated territory, with Chamorro inhabitants gradually regaining and then expanding civil rights and political institutions under U.S. law. The Northern Marianas, including Saipan and Tinian, were placed under United Nations trusteeship administered by the United States as part of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, before later moving towards separate arrangements that included the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in political union with the United States. Japanese settlers were repatriated, while Chamorro and Carolinian communities negotiated land issues, compensation, and cultural preservation in the context of ongoing military basing. In Japan, the memory of the Marianas Campaign intersected with broader narratives of the Pacific War. The loss of Saipan in July 1944 had immediate political consequences, contributing to the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and changes in cabinet personnel. In later decades, accounts by surviving soldiers, sailors, and civilians described experiences of bombardment, evacuation, combat, and captivity, shaping public understanding of the war's middle phase. Memorials and publications emphasized both the deaths of military personnel and the fate of civilians, including those who died during the final days on Saipan. These memories coexisted with analyses by historians who examined operational decisions, resource constraints, and intelligence assessments on both sides. In the United States, Operation Forager became part of the institutional memory of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army. Studies of the Marianas landings influenced post-war doctrines on amphibious operations, joint command structures, and carrier employment. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was used as a case study in radar-directed fighter control, anti-aircraft defense, and the consequences of pilot training policies. At the same time, veteran accounts and local commemorations on Guam highlighted the liberation of an American territory and the participation of Chamorro people as guides, laborers, and, in some cases, combatants alongside U.S. forces. For the island populations themselves, historical significance has been expressed both in public ceremonies and in daily life. War cemeteries, peace memorials, and preserved battlefields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam mark the locations of major engagements, civilian shelters, and former command posts. Tourism, education programs, and local research projects examine how pre-war colonial structures, wartime occupation, battle, and post-war military presence have shaped land use, language, religion, and political institutions. Families trace connections to those who lived through bombardment, displacement, and reconstruction, integrating individual stories into broader regional histories. Historians assessing Operation Forager generally situate it at the intersection of strategy, technology, and local experience. Strategically, the operation shortened the distance between Allied bases and the Japanese home islands, and reduced Japan's ability to protect maritime supply routes. Technologically, it showcased the integration of fast carriers, amphibious shipping, very heavy bombers, and radar-based control systems. At the level of human experience, it transformed the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors and of the civilian populations of the Marianas, who saw their islands move from one imperial framework to another and then into new post-war arrangements. The legacy of Forager therefore extends beyond mid-1944. It is present in the geography of airfields and ports, in legal and political structures governing Guam and the Northern Marianas, in Japanese and American debates over bombing and surrender, and in local efforts to document and interpret the war. The campaign's long-term significance lies not only in its contribution to Japan's eventual defeat, but also in the way it illustrates how a cluster of islands in the Central Pacific became a central node in global military, political, and social transformations during and after the Second World War.